Imagine your last breath, and then what? For the ancient Greeks, death wasn't an end, but a journey to a shadowy realm beneath the earth. You might think of it as a scary place, but for them, it was a part of life, a place all souls would eventually go. But what did that journey truly look like? And what awaited you in the land of the dead? Tonight, we'll guide you through the hidden pathways, the solemn rivers, and the eternal landscapes of the Greek underworld. Discover its powerful rulers, its famous tormented souls, and the surprising rules that governed every spirit. Prepare for a calming journey into the greatest mystery of all, what happens after death. First, a huge thank you for showing so much love to The Untold Story of Medusa. It's sitting at 46,000 views, and we really appreciate you all. We'd love to hear where you're watching this from and what time it is there. I'm always curious to know how far these Greek mythology stories travel. And don't forget to subscribe. Our goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of August. Let's get started. In ancient Greece, people believed that when a person died, their life didn't just end. It changed. It was a journey, a passage from the bright world of the living to the shadowy realm of the dead known as the Underworld. You might think of it as a scary place, but for them, it was a part of life, a place all souls would eventually go. It was not a place of fire and devils like some later ideas of hell. Instead, it was often seen as a dim, quiet place, a realm of shadows where souls continued to exist, but without the strong joys and pains of their mortal lives. The very moment a person died was seen as the separation of their soul, or psyche, from their body. Imagine your last breath leaving your body, and with it, your very essence, your spirit, fluttering away like a butterfly. The ancient Greeks believed that this soul was like a shadowy copy of the person, a ghostly image that would then begin its long journey to the underworld. This was a very important moment, and how it happened could affect what came next for the soul. When a person died, their eyes would often stay open. It was a common and very important custom for a loved one, usually a family member, to gently close the eyes of the deceased. This was a sign of great respect and love, and it was believed to help the soul begin its peaceful journey. If the eyes were left open, it was thought that the soul might not find rest, or that it might be restless and unable to move on properly. This simple act was a final farewell and a blessing for the departing spirit. Right after death, the soul's journey was believed to be towards the west, towards the setting sun. This made perfect sense to the ancient Greeks. The sun set in the west, and darkness followed. So, the land of the dead was often thought to be in the far west, beyond the known world, where the sun finally disappeared each day. The soul would drift, sometimes confused, sometimes longing for the life it left behind, towards this western horizon. It was drawn by an unseen force, a pull towards the realm of Hades. This first step of the journey was often described as lonely and quiet. The soul was no longer tied to its physical body. It could no longer speak aloud or interact with the living in the same way. It was a silent, often mournful journey for the psyche. The air around the dying person might grow cold, and a strange stillness might fall over the room, signaling the departure of the soul. This was a moment of deep sadness for the living as they watched their loved one's spirit begin its solitary path. The ancient Greeks also believed that the way a person died could greatly affect their journey to the underworld and their fate there. If someone died a violent death, especially if it was sudden and unexpected, their soul might be restless or angry. For example, those who died in battle and were left unburied, or those who committed terrible crimes, often faced a more difficult or tormented path in the afterlife. The gods, especially Hades, the ruler of the underworld, kept very strict rules about who could enter his realm peacefully and who would face hardship. This deep understanding of death and the afterlife shaped many of the customs and beliefs of the ancient Greeks. They knew that everyone, no matter how rich or poor, how powerful or humble, would eventually take this journey. It was the one rule that applied to all mortals. This belief made them think deeply about how they lived their lives, how they treated others, and how they honored the gods. They knew that their actions in life, their piety, and their respect for customs like burial rites would determine their fate in the shadowy world beyond. The journey of the soul was just beginning, and the next steps would be crucial for finding peace in the eternal realm. For the ancient Greeks, the moment a person died was just the beginning of a very important process. It wasn't enough for the soul to leave the body. The living had a crucial job to do to make sure that soul could actually enter the underworld and find its proper rest. This job was called proper burial. It was a rule, a sacred rite, that was taken very seriously. If a body was not buried correctly, or not buried at all, the soul would be left to wander forever, unable to find peace in the afterlife. This was a fate worse than death for many Greeks. Imagine a soul, a shadowy figure, trying to cross a dark river, but being pushed back by the ferryman. This was the terrifying reality for souls whose bodies were left unburied. They were stuck, forever trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead, unable to move on. They were often called unburied dead, or wandering shades, and they would sometimes appear to the living begging for the proper rites to be performed so they could finally find rest. The burial process was very detailed and important. It usually began with the prothesis, which was the laying out of the body. The deceased person's eyes and mouth would be closed, and the body would be washed and anointed with oils. Then it would be dressed in a white shroud or fine clothes. The body was laid on a bed in the home, surrounded by mourners, usually women of the family, who would lament and sing sad songs. This part of the ritual allowed family and friends to say their goodbyes and to show their grief openly. It was a way to honor the dead and to help the living begin to accept their loss. After the prothesis came the ekphora, the funeral procession. The body, often placed on a wagon, would be carried from the home to the burial site. This usually happened before dawn, to mark the separation from the world of the living. Family members, friends, and professional mourners would follow, singing laments and showing their sorrow. This public display of grief was important, as it showed respect for the dead person and their family. Finally, the body would be buried or cremated. Burial meant placing the body in a tomb or grave, often with grave goods like pottery, jewelry, or tools that the person might need in the afterlife. Cremation meant burning the body on a funeral pyre, a large pile of wood. After the body was burned, the ashes would be collected and placed in an urn, which was then buried. Both methods were accepted ways to ensure the soul's passage. The key was that the body was properly dealt with and given its final resting place. The most famous story that shows the importance of proper burial is that of Elpenor. You might remember him from our story about Odysseus. Elpenor was one of Odysseus's men. One morning, on the island of Circe, Elpenor had too much wine and fell asleep on the roof. When he woke up suddenly, he forgot where he was and fell off the roof, breaking his neck. He died instantly. A sad and sudden death. Odysseus and his remaining men were very busy preparing to leave Circe's island for their journey to the underworld. In their haste and sorrow, they completely forgot about Elpenor's body. They left it unburied on the island. When Odysseus later traveled to the underworld to speak with the blind prophet Tiresias, the very first soul to appear to him was Elpenor's ghost. Elpenor was a pitiful sight, a shadowy figure, and he begged Odysseus with mournful cries. He explained that his soul was suffering, unable to find peace because his body was left unburied in the world of the living. He pleaded with Odysseus to return to Circe's island, find his body, build a funeral pyre, burn his remains, and bury his ashes with his armor. He also asked for his oar to be placed on top of his grave as a marker. Only then, he said, could his soul finally cross into the realm of Hades and find rest. Odysseus, deeply saddened and ashamed that he had forgotten his comrade, promised to fulfill Elpenor's request. After leaving the underworld, the very first thing Odysseus and his men did was sail back to Circe's island. They found Elpenor's body, carried it with respect, built a funeral pyre, and performed all the proper rites. They burned his body, collected his ashes, buried them, and placed a stone and his oar on top of his grave. Only after this was done did Elpenor's soul find peace, and Odysseus and his men could continue their journey home. This story of Elpenor was a powerful reminder to the ancient Greeks. Proper burial was not just a custom. It was a strict rule enforced by the gods of the underworld. It was a sacred duty for the living, ensuring that the dead could find their eternal rest. To neglect it meant condemning a soul to endless, tormented wandering, a fate that no one wished upon their loved ones. The journey to the underworld truly began not with the last breath, but with the final, respectful rites performed by the living. Even after a body was properly buried, the soul's journey was far from over. There was another very important rule, a payment that every soul needed to make to continue its passage into the depths of the underworld. This rule involved a small but crucial item, a coin, usually a single obelisk, pronounced O-H-Bo-E, lush. Imagine a shadowy river, dark and wide, forming a boundary that no living person could easily cross. This was the river Styx, the most famous river of the underworld, or sometimes the river Acheron, the river of woe. Across these waters waded Charon, pronounced K-A-I-R-on, the old, grumpy ferryman of the dead. Charon was a very old and stern figure, with a long, scraggly beard and eyes that had seen countless souls pass into the darkness. His job was to ferry the souls of the deceased across the murky waters to the other side, where they could continue their journey into Hades' realm. But Charon did not work for free. It was a strict rule of the underworld that every soul needed to pay him for passage. This payment was the obelisk. For this reason, it was a common and deeply important custom for the living to place a small coin under the tongue of the deceased person before burial. This coin was meant to be the fare for Charon's ferry. Without it, a soul could not cross. Imagine the scene: a shadowy soul, having just left its body, drifts towards the riverbank. It sees Charon's rickety old wooden skiff, a small boat, waiting. Countless other ghostly figures, the shades of the unburied dead, are already gathered on the bank. They are wailing and begging Charon to take them across, stretching out their translucent hands. But Charon, stern and unyielding, ignores their pleas. He only extends his boat to those who can pay. If a soul did not have the obelisk, it was a truly terrible fate. They would be left to wander the bleak, misty banks of the river forever. They could never cross into the true underworld, never find rest, never join the other souls. They were stuck in a lonely, mournful existence, forever longing for passage, their cries echoing in the gloom. This was a constant torment, a punishment for the living who had failed to perform this vital rite. It showed just how serious the Greeks were about every step of the burial process. This rule was so important that stories were told about heroes who encountered these wandering, unburied souls. For example, in the story of Odysseus, when he traveled to the underworld, he saw many such souls. The ghost of Elpenor, his forgotten comrade, was one of them. Elpenor begged Odysseus to go back and bury his body properly, and part of that proper burial included placing the coin for Charon. Only then could Elpenor's soul finally cross the river and find peace. The obelisk was more than just a payment. It was a symbol. It showed that the living had honored their duty to the dead, and that the deceased was ready to accept their fate and move on. It was a small bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead, built by a single coin. This custom ensured that the journey of the soul, though dark, could proceed in an orderly way, according to the strict rules set by Hades. It was a weird rule, perhaps, but one that held immense power over the fate of every ancient Greek. After a soul had been properly buried and had its obelisk placed under its tongue, the next crucial step in its journey to the underworld involved crossing a very famous and feared river, the river Styx, pronounced Styx, close B. This was not just any river. It was considered the most important boundary, the ultimate dividing line between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Its waters were dark, swirling, and often described as chilling, reflecting the gloom of the underworld itself. The river Styx was so sacred and powerful that even the gods themselves feared it. It was the river by which the gods swore their most solemn and unbreakable oaths. If a god swore an oath by the river Styx, that oath could never be broken, no matter what. If a god dared to break such an oath, they would suffer terrible consequences, often being forced into a deep coma for a year, unable to breathe or speak, and then cast out from the feasts of the gods for 9 more years. This shows just how seriously the river Styx was taken, even by the all-powerful Olympians. Its power was absolute, a force that bound even the divine. For mortals, the river Styx represented the point of no return. Once a soul crossed its waters, there was no turning back to the world of the living. It was the final farewell, the ultimate separation from everything they had known. This made the crossing a very solemn and often frightening moment for the newly departed souls. The crossing of the Styx was handled by Charon, the old ferryman we met in the last chapter. He was the only one who could guide souls across its treacherous waters. The rule was clear. Mortals could not cross the Styx without Charon, and Charon would only ferry those who had paid their fare with the obelisk. Souls without the coin would be left to wander the bleak banks of the Styx, forever crying out for passage, their mournful wails a constant sound in the gloomy air of the underworld. They were trapped in a terrible limbo, unable to find rest or move on to their final destination. Imagine a scene at the riverbank. Countless shadowy figures, the newly dead, drift towards the water. They are silent, their faces dim, but their longing to cross is clear. Charon, with his stern face and long pole, pushes his small, rickety wooden skiff through the dark water. He takes the obelisk from under the tongue of each soul that can pay, and they step into his boat, their forms barely visible in the dim light. The boat is crowded, filled with the silent passengers on their final journey. The journey across the Styx was often described as cold and silent, a chilling passage into the unknown. The water itself was said to be poisonous to the living, and its touch could bring death. The air was heavy, filled with a sense of finality. As Charon's boat moved across the dark surface, the living world would fade completely from view, replaced by the endless gloom of Hades' realm. Charon rarely spoke, his silence adding to the solemnity of the passage. He was simply performing his duty, a grim and eternal task. Beyond the Styx, other rivers flowed through the underworld, each with its own special meaning. There was the river Acheron, often called the River of Woe or River of Pain, which many souls encountered first, leading them to the Styx. Its waters were said to be filled with the cries and sorrows of the dead. Then there was the river Cocytus, the river of wailing, where the unburied and unmourned souls cried out in their endless torment. And deeper still, the river Phlegethon, the river of fire, a river of molten flame that flowed through the darkest parts of Tartarus, bringing fiery punishment to the wicked. Finally, the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, whose waters souls would drink from to forget their mortal lives, a peaceful but final separation from their past. The river Styx, however, remained the most important. It was the true gateway, the sacred boundary that defined the separation of life and death. Its strict rules, enforced by Charon and backed by the power of the gods, ensured that the journey to the underworld was a one-way trip for souls. It was a reminder that death was final, and that the laws of the cosmos, even for the dead, were absolute and unyielding. The crossing of the Styx was a solemn moment, a chilling passage into the eternal mystery of Hades' domain. After understanding the crucial importance of proper burial and the obelisk, we now meet the very specific figure who enforced these rules. Charon, pronounced Kair, on the ferryman of the dead. He was not a god in the same way as Zeus or Hades, but a very old and powerful spirit, a servant of the underworld whose job was essential to the journey of every soul. Imagine Charon himself. He was usually described as a very old man, with a long, scraggly, often dirty beard and sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to see right through you. His clothes were simple and ragged, and he was always hunched over, leaning on the long pole he used to push his boat. His face was usually set in a grumpy or stern expression, showing little kindness or patience. He had seen countless souls pass into the darkness over thousands of years, and he was tired of it. He was a creature of routine, bound by the strict laws of the underworld. Charon's job was simple but vital: to ferry the souls of the dead across the dark rivers that separated the living world from Hades' realm. These rivers were usually the river Styx or the river Acheron, which means river of woe. His boat was a small, rickety wooden skiff, barely big enough to hold the shadowy figures of the dead. It looked old and worn, but it was strong enough to carry its silent passengers across the gloomy waters. The most important rule for Charon was the obelisk, the coin placed under the tongue of the dead. Charon was very strict about this payment. He would not, under any circumstances, ferry a soul that did not have the coin. He would stand on the riverbank, his hand outstretched, waiting for the payment. If a soul did not offer the coin, he would simply turn his boat away, leaving them stranded. Imagine the scene at the riverbank. Countless shadowy figures, the newly dead, drift towards the water. They are silent, their faces dim and full of longing. They see Charon's boat, their only hope of crossing. Some souls might try to beg, to plead, to offer excuses. But Charon, stern and unyielding, ignores their cries. He only extends his boat to those who can pay. He would look at the mouths of the shades, checking for the coin. If it was there, he would take it, and the soul would step into his boat. If not, he would push them back with his pole, condemning them to their terrible fate. The souls who did not have the obelisk were left to wander the bleak, misty banks of the river forever. They were stuck in a lonely, mournful existence, their cries of despair echoing in the gloom. They could never cross into the true underworld, never find rest, never join the other souls who had passed on. This was a constant torment, a punishment not for their sins in life, but for the failure of the living to perform the proper burial rites. It showed just how serious the Greeks were about every step of the journey to the afterlife. The journey across the river itself was often described as cold and silent. The air was heavy, filled with a sense of finality. As Charon's boat moved across the dark surface, the living world would fade completely from view, replaced by the endless gloom of Hades' realm. Charon rarely spoke, his silence adding to the solemnity of the passage. He was simply performing his duty, a grim and eternal task. There were very few exceptions to Charon's strict rule. Only a handful of living heroes ever managed to cross the river and return. One of the most famous was Orpheus, the legendary musician we talked about. When Orpheus descended into the underworld to bring back his beloved Eurydice, he did not have an obelisk. But when he approached Charon, he took out his magical lyre and began to play. His music was so incredibly beautiful, so filled with sorrow and love, that it touched even Charon's cold, ancient heart. Charon, who had never shown emotion before, was moved to tears. He willingly extended his boat, allowing Orpheus to step aboard, ferrying him across the dark waters of the Styx without a word. This was a rare and powerful moment, showing that even the strictest rules of the underworld could be bent by the sheer power of art and love. Charon's role was a constant reminder to the ancient Greeks that death was a journey with rules. It emphasized the importance of honoring the dead, not just for their sake, but for the peace of their souls. His grumpy, unyielding nature showed that the laws of the underworld were absolute, and only those who followed them or possessed an extraordinary gift like Orpheus could hope to pass. He was the first face many souls saw after death, the gatekeeper to the eternal unknown. While the river Styx held the most sacred oaths and marked the ultimate boundary, another crucial river flowed through the underworld, often serving as the first true pathway for souls entering the realm of the dead. This was the river Acheron, pronounced Acheron, often called the River of Woe or the River of Pain. Its very name meant river of pain or stream of sorrow, and its dark, murky waters truly reflected the sadness and despair that filled the underworld. Imagine a vast, gloomy landscape, perpetually shrouded in mist and dim light. The air is heavy, and a low, mournful sound seems to hang in the air. This is the sound of the river Acheron, a slow-moving, dark river, its surface often disturbed by the silent, drifting souls that flowed upon it. For many, this was the first river they encountered after leaving the world of the living, a somber welcome to the realm of Hades. The Acheron was often seen as the main river of passage, leading souls deeper into the underworld. While some myths say Charon ferried souls across the Styx, others place his ferry on the Acheron, which then flowed into the Styx. Either way, the Acheron was a place of transition, a river that carried the weight of all the sorrows and laments of the dead. Its waters were said to be filled with the cries and grief of those who had passed, a constant reminder of the pain that death brought. The banks of the river Acheron were often described as bleak and desolate. No flowers bloomed there, no birds sang, only gray, withered plants grew from the barren soil. This was a place of quiet despair, where the newly departed souls would gather, waiting for their turn to cross. The silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of the dark water against the banks and the occasional faint wail of a soul filled with sorrow. For the ancient Greeks, the Acheron represented the sadness of death, the grief that accompanied the separation from loved ones and the bright world. It was a river that all souls had to pass, a symbol of the unavoidable sorrow that comes with the end of life. Even the gods themselves, when they thought of the underworld, often pictured the dark waters of the Acheron. This river also had special importance because it was sometimes linked to the concept of punishment. While not a place of active torment like Tartarus, the very act of passing through its gloomy waters, filled with the echoes of sorrow, was a part of the soul's journey into the realm of the dead. It was a reminder that life had ended, and a new, often somber, existence had begun. Heroes who ventured into the underworld, like Odysseus or Orpheus, would have to navigate the Acheron. They would feel its chilling air, hear its mournful sounds, and see the countless souls drifting towards its banks. It was a powerful and humbling experience, a stark reminder of the finality of death and the vastness of Hades' domain. The Acheron, along with the Styx, Cocytus, Phlegethon, and Lethe, formed a complex network of rivers in the underworld, each with its own role in the journey of the soul. But the Acheron, as the river of woe, was a constant symbol of the grief and sadness that accompanied death, a silent, flowing testament to the human experience of loss. Its dark waters carried souls deeper into the eternal mystery, preparing them for what lay beyond its gloomy currents. After successfully crossing the dark rivers of the underworld, the souls, and any rare living visitor, would face the next terrifying obstacle, Cerberus, pronounced S-U-R, Boo. Cerberus was the monstrous three-headed dog, the fearsome guardian of the gates of Hades' realm. His job was simple but absolute, to keep the living from entering the underworld, and, even more importantly, to prevent the dead from ever leaving. He was the ultimate gatekeeper, a terrifying symbol of the finality of death. Imagine Cerberus. He was enormous, a colossal hound with 3 snarling heads, each with sharp, venomous fangs. His body was covered in thick, matted fur, often described as black as night. Instead of a normal tail, he sometimes had a tail made of snakes, and his paws were like those of a lion with sharp claws. His constant presence was marked by a deep, thunderous growl that echoed through the bleak landscape, striking fear into the hearts of any who approached. His breath was said to be poisonous, and his drool was venomous. He was a creature of pure terror, designed to instill fear and enforce the strict rules of Hades. Cerberus was always on guard, eternally watchful. He never slept, or at least one of his heads was always awake. He knew every soul that passed through the gates, and he was absolutely loyal to Hades. His job was to make sure that once a soul entered the underworld, it stayed there forever. And for any living mortal foolish enough to try and sneak in, Cerberus was their worst nightmare. For the vast majority of souls, who were simply shades of the dead, Cerberus was a terrifying but necessary part of their journey. They would pass by him, silent and submissive, knowing that he was the final barrier. They did not try to defy him, for his power was too great. However, a few brave are foolish. Living heroes did manage to pass Cerberus and enter the underworld. These were rare exceptions, and they usually relied on special gifts or incredible abilities to get past the monstrous dog. One such hero was Orpheus, the legendary musician we spoke about in an earlier story. When Orpheus descended into the underworld to bring back his beloved Eurydice, he faced Cerberus at the gates. Orpheus did not try to fight the monster. Instead, he took out his magical lyre. He began to play a melody so incredibly beautiful and soothing, a hypnotic lullaby that filled the gloomy air. The music was so gentle, so calming, that even the ferocious Cerberus felt its spell. His 3 heads slowly began to droop, his terrifying growls softened into soft whimpers, and his glowing eyes, one by one, closed in a deep, peaceful sleep. Orpheus, with his heart pounding, carefully stepped past the slumbering beast, a silent testament to the unparalleled power of his art. This was a unique way to bypass Cerberus, showing that music could charm even the most savage of guardians. Another hero who faced Cerberus was Heracles, the mightiest of all Greek heroes. One of his famous 12 labors, given to him by King Eurystheus, was to capture Cerberus and bring him back to the upper world. This was considered an impossible task, a challenge designed to kill him. Heracles, with his immense strength, did not use music. Instead, he often wrestled Cerberus into submission, sometimes with the help of Hermes or Athena, or by using his incredible physical power to choke the beast until it gave up. He was then able to drag the 3-headed dog, snarling and struggling, up to the world of the living, before returning him to Hades. This showed Heracles' incredible strength and bravery, but it was also a temporary removal of the guardian, not a permanent defeat. Cerberus was more than just a guard dog. He was a symbol of the finality of death. He represented the absolute rule that once a soul entered the underworld, it was there to stay. His constant vigilance ensured the order of Hades' realm, preventing chaos and maintaining the separation between the living and the dead. His terrifying presence was a constant reminder to mortals of the strict, unyielding laws that governed the afterlife. Once a soul had made the sorrowful crossing of the underworld's rivers, guided by the silent ferryman Charon, they had not yet reached their final destination. The journey was far from over. Standing before them, blocking the very entrance to the realm of Hades, was a creature of pure, unbridled terror. This was Cerberus, the monstrous, three-headed hound of hell. He was not just a beast, he was a guardian, a living wall of teeth and fury, and his duty was one of the most important in the entire cosmos. His job was simple, yet absolute. He ensured that the living could not enter the world of the dead, and more importantly, he made certain that the dead could never, ever leave. To picture Cerberus is to imagine a nightmare-given form. He was a dog of immense size, larger than any lion or bear, with a body made of pure, rippling muscle, covered in a coat of shaggy black fur. But his most terrifying feature was, of course, his 3 heads. Each head was alive and independent, with its own set of glowing red eyes that burned with a malevolent fire. Their jaws were filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth, and from their mouths dripped a venomous saliva so potent it was said to cause instant death. His growl was not the sound of a normal animal. It was a deep rumbling thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the underworld, a sound that promised pain and destruction. To make him even more monstrous, his back was often depicted as being covered in writhing snakes, and his tail was a long, scaly serpent that would hiss and strike at anything that came near. Cerberus was the ultimate gatekeeper, a loyal servant to his master Hades. He stood eternally vigilant at the gates, which were often described as being made of dark, unbreakable adamant. For the countless souls of the dead who arrived in a silent, shuffling procession, Cerberus was a fearsome but accepted part of their journey. He would allow the shades to pass by him into the depths of the underworld because they belonged there. He could be surprisingly gentle with the newly arrived spirits, almost like a grim, welcoming committee. But if any of those shades ever tried to turn back, to flee the realm of Hades, and return to the light of the living world, Cerberus's nature would change in an instant. He would become a whirlwind of fury, his 3 heads snapping and snarling, tearing the foolish soul apart and ensuring it never challenged the laws of the dead again. For a living mortal to face Cerberus was a different matter entirely. It was considered an impossible task. Only a handful of the greatest heroes in all of Greek mythology ever managed to get past him. The most famous of these was the mighty Heracles. As the 12th and final of his impossible labors, Heracles was commanded to descend into the underworld and bring Cerberus back to the world of the living. This was meant to be a suicide mission. Yet Heracles, protected by the gods, journeyed into the darkness. He did not use tricks or magic. Instead, he relied on his incredible, godlike strength. He found Cerberus at the gates and wrestled with the monstrous beast, his powerful arms wrapped around its 3 necks. The battle was titanic, but Heracles was stronger. He squeezed until the great hound whimpered and submitted. He then dragged the fearsome creature all the way up to the court of King Eurystheus, who was so terrified at the sight of the beast that he hid in a large jar. After proving his success, Heracles, as promised, returned the guardian to his rightful place at the gates of Hades. This act cemented Heracles' legend as the greatest of all heroes, the one man strong enough to overcome death itself. Deep within the earth, in a realm of eternal twilight, sat the ruler of the dead. He was not a monster or a demon, but a god, one of the most powerful beings in the cosmos. He was Hades, the stern and unyielding king of the underworld. His name was so feared by mortals that they often avoided saying it aloud, instead calling him Pluton, which means the rich one, a reference to the countless precious metals and gems hidden deep within his earthly domain. But his true wealth was not gold or silver. It was the countless souls of the dead, for every mortal who ever lived would one day become his subject. Hades was one of the 3 great sons of the Titan Cronus, along with his brothers Zeus and Poseidon. When they defeated their father and the other titans, they divided the world among themselves. Zeus, the youngest, claimed the sky and became the king of the gods. Poseidon took the seas, becoming the ruler of the oceans. And Hades, the eldest, was given the vast, dark realm beneath the earth, the Underworld. It was not a kingdom he chose, but it was the one he was fated to rule, and he took his duty with the utmost seriousness. He was not an evil god, despite his gloomy domain. In fact, he was one of the most just and fair of all the gods. He was simply stern, silent, and utterly immovable in his judgments. To imagine Hades is to picture a figure of solemn, regal majesty. He sat upon a grand throne made of solid black ebony, a powerful and imposing figure. He had dark hair and a thick dark beard, and his eyes were said to be as deep and mysterious as the shadows he commanded. He rarely smiled, and his voice, when he spoke, was low and final. He held a bident, a two-pronged staff that was the symbol of his power, and at his side often lay his loyal, three-headed hound, Cerberus. Unlike his brother Zeus, who often meddled in the affairs of mortals, Hades almost never left his kingdom. He was a recluse, content to rule over his silent subjects and ensure that the laws of the underworld were obeyed without question. His most important law was the one that governed the separation of the living and the dead. Hades was incredibly strict about this. The living were not welcome in his realm, and the dead were never, ever allowed to leave. He saw this not as cruelty, but as a necessary part of the natural order of the universe. Life and death were two separate states, and it was his sacred duty to maintain that boundary. Any mortal who dared to enter his kingdom uninvited, or any soul who tried to escape, would face his full, unyielding wrath. His punishments were not born of anger, but of a deep sense of justice and order. Despite his fearsome reputation, Hades was not a god of death in the way we might think. The actual god of death, the one who carried souls away from the world of the living, was Thanatos. Hades was the ruler of the place where the dead went. He was a king, a manager of the afterlife. He oversaw the judgments of souls, ensuring that the wicked were punished in the pits of Tartarus and the virtuous were rewarded in the sunlit fields of Elysium. He was the ultimate authority, a final word in the fate of every mortal soul. His kingdom was vast and complex, with its own rivers, landscapes, and inhabitants, and he ruled it all with a firm, steady hand. He was a lonely god, perhaps, surrounded by shadows and silence. But he was also one of the most powerful and respected, a true king in his own dark and mysterious domain. The king of the underworld, the stern and solitary Hades, did not rule his shadowy realm alone. By his side sat a queen, a figure as beautiful as the spring flowers, yet as solemn as the eternal twilight of her kingdom. This was Persephone, the reluctant but powerful queen of the dead. Her story is one of the most famous in all of Greek mythology, a tale of abduction, sorrow, and the creation of the seasons. She was a goddess of two worlds, a bridge between the bright, living earth and the dark, silent realm below. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest and agriculture. In her youth, she was a joyful and carefree maiden named Kor, which simply means the maiden. She spent her days in sunlit meadows, gathering flowers with her nymph companions, her laughter echoing in the warm air. She was the very picture of life and innocence, but her beauty caught the eye of the lonely king of the underworld. One day, as Persephone was picking flowers in a field, Hades burst forth from a chasm in the earth, riding his golden chariot pulled by black horses. In a swift, shocking moment, he seized the terrified maiden and pulled her down with him into his dark kingdom, the earth closing silently above them. Demeter was overcome with grief. Her beloved daughter was gone, and no one, not even the gods, would tell her where she had been taken. In her sorrow and rage, Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, refused to let anything grow on the earth. The fields became barren, the trees lost their leaves, and a cold, harsh winter fell upon the world. famine spread, and mortals began to starve. The cries of humanity reached Mount Olympus, and Zeus finally knew he had to act. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, down to the underworld with a command for Hades. He must release Persephone. Hades, ever the just ruler, knew he could not defy a direct order from Zeus. He agreed to let Persephone go. But before she left, the clever king offered her a final gift, a single, glistening pomegranate. Persephone, who had refused all food in the underworld out of sorrow, was tempted by the sweet, jewel-like seeds. She ate just a few, perhaps 6 or 7. This small act, however, was a trick. It was an ancient law of the fates that anyone who ate the food of the underworld was bound to it forever. By eating the pomegranate seeds, Persephone had unknowingly sealed her own fate. When she returned to the world above, Demeter was overjoyed, and life returned to the earth. But the truth of the pomegranate seeds was soon revealed. A compromise had to be made. Because she had eaten the food of the dead, she could not remain in the world of the living permanently. It was decided that for part of the year, she would live with her mother on earth. During this time, Demeter would be happy, and the world would flourish in spring and summer. But for the months corresponding to the number of seeds she had eaten, Persephone had to return to the underworld and take her place as its queen, sitting beside her husband Hades. During this time, Demeter would mourn, and the world would fall into the cold, barren grip of autumn and winter. And so, Persephone became a goddess of 2 realms. She was no longer just the innocent maiden, Kore. She was now Persephone, the solemn and respected queen of the underworld. She brought a touch of life and beauty to the gloomy kingdom, and it was said that even the pale shades of the dead were calmed by her presence. She was a just and fair ruler, and she held a unique power, for she understood both the light of life and the darkness of death. Her story was a powerful explanation for the changing of the seasons, a constant, yearly reminder of the unbreakable bond between the world above and the mysterious, silent kingdom below. At the very heart of the underworld, in the center of its vast and shadowy plains, stood the palace of Hades and Persephone. This was not a place of light and music like the golden halls of Mount Olympus. It was a fortress of darkness and silence, a monument to the eternal and unchanging nature of the dead. The palace was a place of somber majesty, a testament to the immense power and wealth of its reclusive king. It was from here, in their grand and gloomy throne room, that the rulers of the underworld oversaw their silent kingdom and passed judgment on the souls of mortals. Imagine a vast hall, so large that its ceiling is lost in shadow. The walls are not made of bright marble, but of polished black obsidian, a volcanic glass so smooth and dark that it seems to drink the little light that exists in this realm. The floors are paved with slabs of dark gray stone, worn smooth by the countless, silent footsteps of the shades who have been brought before the king and queen. There are no windows to let in the sun, for the sun does not shine here. The only light comes from strange, glowing fungi that grow in clusters on the walls, and from torches that burn with a cold, smokeless, blue-white fire, casting long, dancing shadows that seem to have a life of their own. In the center of this vast hall, raised on a high platform, sit 2 thrones. The throne of Hades is the larger of the 2, a massive, imposing chair carved from a single, solid piece of black ebony. It is decorated with intricate carvings of scenes from the underworld, the 5 rivers, the fields of asphodel, and the tormented figures of Tartarus. At its feet, the loyal hound Cerberus often lies, his 3 heads resting on his paws, his eyes ever watchful. Hades himself sits upon this throne, a figure of immense and silent power, his dark eyes surveying all who enter his hall. Beside him, on a slightly smaller but no less beautiful throne, sits Persephone. Her throne is made of a dark, polished silver, inlaid with patterns of twisting vines and pomegranate fruits, a constant reminder of the story that brought her to this dark kingdom. When she is in the underworld, her demeanor is as solemn as her husband's, but her presence brings a strange, sad beauty to the grim hall. She is the queen of this realm, and her authority is second only to that of Hades himself. Together, they form a powerful and striking pair, the king and queen of all that lies beneath the earth. The atmosphere in the throne room is one of absolute silence and stillness. The shades of the dead who are brought here do not speak unless spoken to. They stand before the thrones, their forms flickering like candle flames in a breeze, awaiting their judgment. There is no sound of laughter or conversation, only the faint echoing drip of water from some unseen cavern, and the low rumbling growl of Cerberus. It is a place of immense gravity, where the final fate of every mortal is decided. The air is thick with the weight of ages, with the knowledge that this hall has seen the end of every story, the final chapter of every life. It is a place of pure, unadulterated power, the silent, beating heart of the kingdom of the dead. While Hades and Persephone were the ultimate rulers of the underworld, they did not personally judge every single soul that entered their realm. The task of determining the final fate of mortals was delegated to a special council of 3 judges. These were not just any spirits. They were the souls of 3 kings who had been so wise, just, and fair during their time on earth that they were given the immense honor and responsibility of serving as the judges of the dead for all eternity. Their names were Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, and it was their duty to ensure that every soul received the afterlife it had earned. The 3 judges would sit in a great, open field, often described as being at a crossroads where the paths to the different realms of the underworld diverged. Before them, the shades of the dead would be brought, one by one, to have their lives examined. This was a moment of pure truth. In the underworld, a soul could not lie or hide its true nature. All of its deeds, both good and bad, were laid bare for the judges to see. The soul's heart was, in a sense, an open book, and the judges were expert readers. Rhadamanthus was often seen as the primary judge for the souls of those who came from the lands of Asia, and he was known for his unyielding adherence to the law. He was stern and fair, and he would carefully question the souls, weighing their actions against the strict codes of divine justice. He was particularly concerned with crimes that had gone unpunished in the mortal world. No secret was safe from his piercing gaze, and he would ensure that justice, which had been avoided in life, was finally delivered in death. Aeacus was the judge of the souls who came from Europe. He was known for his wisdom and his ability to see into the hearts of mortals. He held a scepter, a symbol of his authority, and he was often the one who would guard the very keys to the underworld. He was a fair and impartial judge, and his role was to ensure that the souls were sorted correctly, sending them down the path that corresponded to the life they had lived. The most famous of the 3 judges, however, was Minos. In life, he had been the powerful and legendary king of Crete, the one who had commissioned the labyrinth to house the Minotaur. While he had been a flawed and sometimes cruel king in life, he was also known for giving his people a strong set of laws. In death, he was transformed into the final and most powerful of the 3 judges. He held the deciding vote. After Rhadamanthus and Aeacus had given their opinions, it was Minos who would make the final, unchangeable decision. He would look upon the soul, weigh all of its deeds in the balance, and then, with a silent nod, sentence it to its eternal fate. The process was simple but profound. The judges would examine the soul's entire life, from its first breath to its last. They were not interested in wealth or status. A king was judged by the same standards as a beggar. All that mattered was whether the person had lived a life of virtue, piety, and justice, or one of wickedness, cruelty, and disrespect for the gods. Based on this judgment, the soul would be sent down one of 3 paths. The vast majority, who had been neither particularly good nor particularly bad, were sent to the gray and monotonous fields of asphodel. Those who had lived lives of exceptional virtue and heroism were sent to the sunlit paradise of the Elysian Fields, and those who had committed terrible crimes were sent down the dark path to the pits of Tartarus to face an eternity of punishment. The judgment of these three kings was the most important moment in a soul's journey, the final accounting that would define its existence for all time. The judgment of the dead was not a matter of opinion or guesswork. The three great judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, relied on a powerful and impartial tool to help them make their eternal decisions. This was the scales of justice, a divine instrument that could measure the true worth of a soul's life. The process was a powerful symbol of the Greek belief that, in the end, every action has weight and every life would be held accountable. The scales did not lie, and their verdict was absolute. Imagine a large, ornate set of scales, crafted from a celestial metal that shone with a faint, golden light, even in the gloom of the underworld. They were perfectly balanced, held aloft by an unseen force in the great field of judgment. This was where the true nature of a soul was revealed, not through words, but through the simple, undeniable pull of gravity. The god Hermes, in his role as a psychopomp, or guide of souls, would often be the one to oversee this process. He would lead the silent, trembling shade before the scales and prepare it for its final evaluation. The process itself was deeply symbolic. On one side of the scale, a single, pure feather of the goddess Ma'at, the personification of truth and justice, would sometimes be placed, representing perfect righteousness. On the other side, the soul's heart, which was seen as the seat of its conscience and the record of its life, would be weighed. In other traditions, the deeds themselves were placed on the scales. The good deeds, acts of kindness, piety, bravery, and compassion, were placed on one pan. The bad deeds, acts of cruelty, hubris, betrayal, and impiety, were placed on the other. As the deeds were placed upon the scales, the balance would begin to shift. A life filled with virtue and goodness would cause the pan of good deeds to sink low, outweighing the bad. This was a sign that the soul was worthy of a peaceful and blessed afterlife. The judges would see the verdict of the scales, and with a nod of approval, they would direct the soul towards the sunlit paths that led to the Elysian Fields. For these souls, the moment of judgment was a validation, a confirmation that their struggles and sacrifices in the mortal world had been worthwhile. However, if a soul had lived a life of wickedness and corruption, the scales would tell a different story. The pan of bad deeds would grow heavy, sinking lower and lower, while the pan of good deeds would rise high into the air. This was an undeniable sign of a life misspent, a soul stained by evil. The judges would look upon this verdict with stern, unforgiving eyes. There was no room for excuses or bargains. The evidence was clear, weighed in the balance for all to see. These souls would be condemned, directed away from the paths of peace and down the dark, treacherous road that led to the eternal punishments of Tartarus. For the vast majority of souls, the scales would balance almost perfectly. Their lives had been a mixture of good and bad, of moments of kindness and moments of selfishness. They were not virtuous enough for Elysium, but not wicked enough for Tartarus. For these souls, the scales would hover, nearly level, and the judges would sentence them to the most common of all afterlives, an eternity spent wandering as a listless, forgetful shade in the gray, monotonous fields of asphodel. It was not a punishment, but it was not a reward either. It was simply an endless, unchanging existence, a reflection of a life that had been, in the grand cosmic sense, unremarkable. The scales of justice were a powerful and terrifying symbol, a reminder to all mortals that their actions mattered and that in the end, every soul would be weighed, measured, and judged. After the judgment, after the weighing of deeds on the great scales of justice, the vast majority of souls were not sent to a paradise of eternal joy, nor were they condemned to a pit of endless torment. For the ordinary person, the farmer, the craftsman, the soldier who had lived a life that was a mix of good and bad. The final destination was a place of profound and unending monotony. This was the Asphodel Meadows, the realm of the average, the gray and ghostly landscape where most of humanity would spend the rest of eternity. Imagine a vast, sprawling field that stretches to the horizon in every direction. There is no sun or moon in the sky, only a perpetual dim twilight that casts no shadows. The ground is covered not with green grass, but with strange, pale, ghostly flowers called asphodels. These are the only plants that grow here, their gray stalks and limp, colorless petals, a perfect reflection of the realm's utter lack of vibrancy. The air is still and silent, with no breeze to rustle the leaves, no birds to sing, no sound of laughter or weeping. It is a place of absolute neutrality, devoid of all passion and all feeling. This was the afterlife for the common soul. It was not a punishment. There was no pain here, no suffering. But there was also no joy. There was no love, no ambition, no creativity, no memory of the vibrant life that had come before. The souls who wandered the Asphodel Meadows were mere shades of their former selves. They were like sleepwalkers, drifting aimlessly through the pale flowers, their faces blank and expressionless. They recognized each other, but they felt no connection. They might see their mother, their brother, or their best friend, but they would feel no flicker of the love or camaraderie they had once shared. The great hero Achilles, when visited by Odysseus in the Underworld, famously said that he would rather be a poor servant to a dirt-poor farmer on earth than be the king of all the dead. This powerful statement perfectly captures the Greek view of this ordinary afterlife. It was a bleak and empty existence, a hollow echo of the real world. The shades in the Asphodel Meadows had no purpose. They did not work, they did not play, they did not dream. They simply existed, wandering for all time in a state of quiet, forgetful listlessness. This vision of the afterlife reflects a deep-seated aspect of the ancient Greek worldview. They loved the world of the living. They valued passion, honor, beauty, and action. The idea of an eternity without these things was, to them, a truly sorrowful fate. The Asphodel Meadows served as a powerful reminder to live life to the fullest, to strive for greatness, to create a legacy that would be remembered on earth, because the alternative was to be forgotten, to become just another nameless, drifting shade in the endless, gray fields of the underworld. It was a quiet, somber fate, a peaceful but ultimately empty end for the countless millions who had lived and died without achieving either great virtue or great wickedness. While the majority of souls were destined for the gray monotony of the Asphodel Meadows, there was another, far more desirable fate, awaiting those who had lived lives of exceptional virtue, heroism, and piety. This was a place of eternal joy and peace, a paradise within the underworld, known as the Elysian Fields, or Elysium. It was the ultimate reward for a life well lived, a beautiful, sunlit realm that stood in stark contrast to the gloom and sorrow of the rest of Hades' domain. Imagine a place that is the complete opposite of the Asphodel Meadows. Here, the sky is not a dim twilight, but a soft, golden light that seems to radiate from the very air itself. A gentle, warm breeze always blows, carrying the sweet scent of countless vibrant flowers that bloom in every color imaginable. The fields are covered in lush green grass, and groves of beautiful shady trees are filled with the sound of birdsong. Crystal-clear streams flow through the meadows, their waters sparkling and pure. It is a place of perfect, unending spring, a paradise where there is no pain, no sorrow, no hard work, and no death. The souls who were judged worthy of Elysium were a very select group. They were the great heroes, like Achilles and Menelaus, who had shown incredible bravery and honor in battle. They were the just and righteous kings who had ruled their people with wisdom and compassion, They were the priests and priestesses who had shown unwavering devotion to the gods, and they were the ordinary people who had lived lives of such profound goodness and kindness that they had earned a place among the blessed. These were the souls who had tipped the scales of justice heavily in their favor, whose good deeds had far outweighed their bad. In the Elysian Fields, these blessed souls did not wander as mindless, forgetful shades. They retained their memories, their personalities, and their passions. They spent their days in joyful pursuits, doing the things they had loved most in life. The warriors would practice their skills in friendly competitions, their armor gleaming in the golden light. The poets and musicians would compose beautiful songs and stories, their voices echoing through the peaceful groves. The philosophers would engage in deep and meaningful conversations, exploring the mysteries of the universe for all eternity. It was a life of perfect leisure and contentment. There was no need for food or drink, but there were always grand banquets laid out, with the sweet nectar and ambrosia of the gods available for all. The souls in Elysium were free from all the cares and worries of mortal life. They were in a state of perpetual bliss, surrounded by beauty and peace, in the company of the greatest and most virtuous souls who had ever lived. It was the ultimate reward, a testament to the Greek belief that while the gods demanded justice, they also offered a beautiful and lasting hope for those who lived a life of honor and righteousness. The Elysian Fields were a shining beacon in the darkness of the underworld, a promise that even after death, there could be a paradise for the truly good. For the ancient Greeks, the paradise of the Elysian Fields was the ultimate reward for a virtuous life. But for a very, very select few, there was an even greater honor, a higher level of paradise that was almost impossible to achieve. This was the Isles of the Blessed, a realm so perfect and so exclusive that it was reserved only for the absolute greatest of souls, those who had proven their worth not just once, but multiple times. It was the pinnacle of the afterlife, a place of unimaginable peace and joy. The Isles of the Blessed were thought to be a set of beautiful remote islands located in the far western ocean, near the edge of the world. Unlike the Elysian Fields, which were still technically part of the underworld, these islands were a separate realm, touched by the golden light of the sun and cooled by the gentle breezes of the ocean. Here, the paradise was even more perfect. The flowers were more vibrant, the fruits on the trees were sweeter, and the music of the birds was more beautiful. It was a place where the souls of the blessed could live in a state of perfect, unchanging happiness, completely free from any lingering sorrow or memory of the hardships of their mortal lives. So, how did a soul earn the right to enter this ultimate paradise? The path was incredibly difficult. According to the poet Hesiod, a soul had to first be judged worthy of the Elysian Fields. After spending a lifetime there, that soul would be given the chance to be reborn back into the world of the living. They would drink from the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, to wipe their minds clean of their time in paradise, and then they would be sent back to earth to live another mortal life. If, in this second life, they once again lived with such extraordinary virtue and heroism that they were judged worthy of Elysium, they would return to the paradise after death. And then the cycle would repeat. They would be offered the chance to be reborn a third time. If, in this third life, they once again lived a life of perfect righteousness and were admitted to the Elysian Fields for a third time, only then would they be granted the ultimate reward. They would no longer be reborn. Instead, they would be sent to the Isles of the Blessed to live for all eternity in a state of perfect, unchanging bliss. This was a feat that was almost unheard of. To live one life of perfect virtue was hard enough. To do it 3 times in a row was a testament to a soul's unwavering commitment to goodness. The few who were said to have achieved this honor were some of the greatest figures in Greek mythology. Heroes like Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, and Peleus, the father of Achilles, were sometimes said to reside on these blessed isles. It was a place where they could finally rest, their trials and tribulations over, their virtue rewarded in the most magnificent way imaginable. The Isles of the Blessed were a powerful symbol of the Greek belief in reincarnation and the idea that the soul could be perfected over time, a shining, distant hope that offered the possibility of an even greater paradise beyond the already beautiful fields of Elysium. Just as there was a paradise for the virtuous, there was a place of eternal punishment for the truly wicked. This was Tartarus, the deepest, darkest, and most terrifying region of the underworld. It was not just a place of sorrow or monotony. It was a prison of active, unending torment, a place where the greatest sinners and the enemies of the gods were sent to suffer for all eternity. The very name of Tartarus was whispered with fear, for it represented the ultimate and most dreadful fate that could befall a soul. Tartarus was imagined as a vast, bottomless pit, located as far beneath the earth as the earth is beneath the sky. The poet Hesiod wrote that a bronze anvil dropped from heaven would fall for 9 days before it reached the earth, and it would fall for another 9 days before it reached the bottom of Tartarus. It was a place of absolute darkness, a realm of suffocating gloom, where no light, not even the dim twilight of the rest of the underworld, could penetrate. The entrance to Tartarus was guarded by massive bronze gates, and the entire pit was surrounded by a mighty wall of solid bronze, ensuring that no one who entered could ever escape. This was not a place for ordinary sinners. The souls who were condemned to Tartarus were those who had committed the most heinous crimes imaginable. They were the mortals who had dared to challenge the gods, who had shown unforgivable hubris, who had betrayed their sacred oaths, or who had committed acts of unspeakable cruelty against their fellow humans. It was also the eternal prison for the greatest enemies of the Olympian gods, the mighty Titans. After their defeat in the great war known as the Titanomachy, Zeus had cast his father Cronus and the other rebellious Titans down into the black abyss of Tartarus, where they were bound in chains and guarded by monstrous beings called the Hecaton chairs, giants with 100 hands and 50 heads. The punishments in Tartarus were not random. They were specifically designed to fit the crimes of the sinner, often in a cruel and ironic way. The goal was not just to cause pain, but to create a state of endless, frustrating, and meaningless suffering. The souls here were fully conscious, fully aware of their torment, and they knew that it would never, ever end. The landscape of Tartarus itself was a part of the punishment. It was a place of fire and ice, of foul-smelling smoke and chilling winds. The river Phlegethon, the river of fire, flowed through its depths, its molten lava, illuminating the horrific scenes of eternal suffering. Tartarus was a powerful and terrifying concept for the ancient Greeks. It was the ultimate deterrent, a clear message that the laws of the gods and the rules of morality were not to be trifled with. It served as a stark reminder that, for every action, there is a consequence, and for those who chose a path of great evil, the consequence was an eternity of unimaginable pain and despair in the deepest, darkest pit of the cosmos. It was the dark heart of the underworld, a place of pure, unending horror from which there was no escape and no reprieve. Deep within the fiery pits of Tartarus, where the greatest sinners were sent to face their eternal punishments, there was a figure who became the ultimate symbol of meaningless, frustrating labor. This was Sisyphus, a king so clever and so full of trickery that he dared to cheat death itself, not once, but twice. For his incredible hubris and his disrespect for the natural order of the universe, the gods condemned him to a punishment that was as clever and as cruel as his own schemes, an eternity of pointless, exhausting effort. In life, Sisyphus was the king of Corinth, and he was known throughout Greece for his cunning and his wit. He was a master of deception, and he believed he was smarter than everyone, including the gods. His greatest crime came when he managed to trick Thanatos, the god of death. When Thanatos came to claim him, Sisyphus cleverly trapped him in chains. With death himself imprisoned, no one on earth could die. This threw the entire world into chaos. The old and sick suffered without end, and the god of war, Ares, was furious because his battles lost their deadly consequences. Finally, the gods intervened, freed Thanatos, and Sisyphus was killed. But his trickery was not over. Before he died, he had given his wife specific instructions not to perform the proper funeral rites for his body. So, when he arrived in the underworld, he went before Persephone, the queen of the dead, and complained that he had been wrongfully denied a proper burial. He pleaded with her to let him return to the world of the living for just a short time so he could punish his wife for her supposed negligence. Persephone, taking pity on him, agreed. But once Sisyphus was back in the sunlit world, he had no intention of returning. He laughed at the gods he had fooled and lived on for many more years, until Hermes was finally sent to drag him forcibly back to the underworld. For his crimes of cheating death and mocking the gods, Zeus himself devised a special punishment. Sisyphus was taken to a steep, rocky hill in the darkest part of Tartarus. At the bottom of the hill was a massive, heavy boulder. His task was simple. He had to push this boulder all the way to the top of the hill. The task required all of his strength and all of his focus. He would strain every muscle, his body slick with sweat, his feet slipping on the loose rocks. He would push and push, inch by agonizing inch, for what felt like an eternity. And then, just as he was about to reach the very peak, just as he thought he might finally succeed, the boulder would slip from his grasp. It would teeter on the edge for a heart-stopping moment, and then it would come crashing and tumbling all the way back down to the bottom of the hill, undoing all of his hard work in an instant. Sisyphus would watch it go, his heart filled with despair, and then, with a heavy sigh, he would trudge back down the hill to start his pointless task all over again. This was his eternal fate. He was condemned to an eternity of hope, followed by an eternity of despair. The punishment was not just physical, it was psychological. It was the endless, soul-crushing repetition of a task that could never be completed. Sisyphus, the man who thought he could outsmart the gods, was now trapped in a cycle of meaningless effort, a powerful and terrifying symbol of the ultimate punishment for those who dared to defy the fundamental laws of life and death. Not far from the eternally struggling Sisyphus, another figure in Tartarus suffered a punishment that was just as cruel and ironic. This was Tantalus, a king who had once been a great favorite of the gods, but whose horrific crime earned him an eternity of unquenchable desire. His punishment has become a timeless symbol of temptation without satisfaction, a torment that gave us the word tantalize. Tantalus was a son of Zeus and a king of a wealthy kingdom in Anatolia. He was so beloved by the gods that he was often invited to Mount Olympus to dine with them at their grand feasts, a rare honor for a mortal. He would sit at their table, listen to their divine conversation, and eat their ambrosia and drink their nectar. But this closeness to the gods made him arrogant. He grew to believe that he was their equal, and he began to test their power and their knowledge in a truly monstrous way. To see if the gods were truly all-knowing, Tantalus committed an act of unspeakable horror. He invited the gods to a feast at his own palace. But for the main course, he killed his own son Pelops, chopped him into pieces, and served him to the gods in a stew. He wanted to see if they would be able to tell that they were eating human flesh. The gods, of course, were not fooled. They were instantly aware of the horrific crime, and they were overcome with disgust and rage. All of them, that is, except for Demeter. She was so distracted by the grief of her missing daughter Persephone that she absent-mindedly ate a piece of the boy's shoulder. The gods were furious. They reassembled the body of Pelops, and the missing shoulder was replaced with a piece of gleaming ivory. They then brought the boy back to life, more beautiful than before. But for Tantalus, there would be no such mercy. His crime was one of the worst imaginable. He had violated the sacred laws of hospitality, he had betrayed the trust of the gods, and he had committed a horrific act of filicide. For this, he was cast down into the deepest pits of Tartarus to face a punishment designed to torture him for all time. He was made to stand in a pool of cool, clear water that came right up to his chin. He was consumed by a raging thirst, his throat dry and cracked. But every time he bent down to take a drink, the water would recede, sinking into the ground and disappearing before he could get a single drop. The water would then rise back up around him, forever tempting him, but never allowing him to quench his agonizing thirst. Above his head, from the branches of a beautiful fruit tree, hung the most delicious-looking fruits imaginable: ripe, juicy pears, sweet figs, and glistening pomegranates. Tantalus was also tormented by a gnawing, unbearable hunger. But every time he reached up to pluck a piece of fruit, a gust of wind would sweep down and blow the branches just out of his reach. The fruit would dance before his eyes, its sweet scent filling the air, but he could never, ever taste it. This was his eternal fate, to be forever trapped in a state of agonizing hunger and thirst, with the very things he craved always just inches away, forever tempting and forever unobtainable. It was a punishment that perfectly mirrored his crime. Just as he had offered the gods a feast that was a horrific illusion, he was now surrounded by a feast that was an eternal, torturous illusion for him. Among the great sinners of Tartarus, there was one whose punishment was a dizzying, fiery nightmare, a testament to the terrible consequences of betraying the trust of the king of the gods himself. This was Ixion, a king whose crimes of murder and audacious impiety earned him an eternity of spinning in flames, a terrifying spectacle of divine retribution. Ixion's story begins with a crime that was already quite serious. He was a king of the Lapiths in Thessaly, and he had promised his father-in-law a handsome gift for the right to marry his daughter Dia. However, once he was married, Ixion refused to pay the bride price. His father-in-law, in retaliation, stole some of Ixion's valuable horses. Ixion, hiding his rage, invited his father-in-law to a great feast at his palace. But this was a trap. When his father-in-law arrived, Ixion pushed him into a pit of burning coals and wood that he had set up, murdering him in cold blood. This was a horrific crime, a violation of the sacred laws of hospitality and kinship. The murder of a family member was a sin that stained the soul, and the other kings and princes of Greece were so horrified that they refused to perform the purification rituals necessary to cleanse Ixion of his guilt. He became an outcast, shunned by all mortals. But Zeus, the king of the gods, for reasons of his own, took pity on the tormented king. He decided to purify Ixion himself, an act of immense divine grace. He then invited Ixion to Mount Olympus to dine with the gods, just as he had once invited Tantalus. But like Tantalus, Ixion proved to be a terrible guest. Instead of being grateful for Zeus's mercy, he became arrogant and entitled. And then he committed his greatest and most unforgivable sin. He began to lust after Zeus's own wife, the queen of the gods, Hera. He secretly desired her, and he planned to seduce her, a shocking act of betrayal against the very god who had saved him. Zeus, being all-knowing, was aware of Ixion's treacherous intentions. To test him, Zeus created a phantom, a cloud in the perfect shape and image of Hera. He named this cloud clone Nephele. That night, Ixion, believing he was seducing the queen of the gods, embraced the cloud phantom. From this strange union, a monstrous new race of creatures was born, the centaurs, half human and half horse. Zeus had all the proof he needed. Ixion's betrayal was complete. His rage was immense. He struck Ixion with a thunderbolt, a symbol of his divine fury, and then he cast him down into the deepest pits of Tartarus. There, he was bound to a great, fiery wheel. This was not an ordinary wheel. It was a wheel of fire, and it never ever stopped turning. Ixion was stretched out and tied to this wheel, his limbs spread wide as it spun endlessly through the fiery air of Tartarus. His punishment was eternal and inescapable. He was forever trapped in a dizzying, burning whirlwind, a constant, agonizing reminder of his terrible crimes. He had murdered his own family, and then he had tried to betray the king of the gods who had shown him mercy. His fiery, spinning torment was a powerful warning to all mortals. The grace of the gods was a precious gift, and to abuse it was to invite a punishment of unimaginable and unending horror. Not all of the famous punishments in Tartarus were for kings who had defied the gods. Some were for groups of mortals who had committed horrific crimes against their own families. The most famous of these were the Danaids, the 50 daughters of King Danaus, whose terrible act of mass murder earned them an eternity of frustrating and pointless labor, a punishment that echoed the emptiness of their crime. The story of the Danaids is a complex tale of family rivalry and forced marriage. King Danaus had a twin brother, Aegyptus, who was the king of Egypt. Aegyptus had 50 sons, and he was determined that his sons should marry the 50 daughters of Danaus in order to consolidate his power and control his brother's kingdom. Danaus, however, feared his brother's ambition and did not want his daughters to be forced into these marriages. To escape, he built a great ship, the first of its kind, and fled with his 50 daughters across the sea to his ancestral homeland of Argos in Greece. But Aegyptus and his 50 sons pursued them. They cornered Danaus in Argos and demanded that the weddings take place. Danaus, seeing no other way out, finally agreed. He pretended to accept the marriages, and he arranged a great wedding feast. But secretly, he was plotting a terrible revenge. On the wedding night, he gave each of his 50 daughters a sharp dagger, and he commanded them to do the unthinkable. They were to murder their new husbands in their sleep. That night, as the 50 sons of Aegyptus slept, 49 of the Danaids followed their father's cruel command. They crept into the bedrooms of their new husbands and, with cold hearts, they stabbed them, killing them in their beds. It was a horrific act of betrayal and mass murder, a terrible violation of the sacred bonds of marriage. Only one of the 50 daughters, the youngest, whose name was Hypermnestra, refused to obey. She had fallen in love with her new husband, Lynceus, and she could not bring herself to kill him. She helped him escape, saving his life and showing that she, at least, still had a conscience. For their terrible crime, the 49 murderous sisters were eventually condemned to the pits of Tartarus. Their punishment was not one of fire or physical pain, but one of endless, soul-crushing futility. They were taken to a part of Tartarus where there was a large stone jar, or sometimes a trough, that was filled with cracks and holes. Their task was to fill this leaky jar with water, which they had to carry from a nearby stream using pitchers that were also riddled with holes. And so, for all eternity, the 49 Danaids are locked in a pointless cycle. They walk to the stream, fill their leaky pitchers, and then hurry back to the jar, most of the water spilling out before they can get there. The little water they do manage to pour into the great jar immediately leaks out through the cracks in the bottom. The jar can never be filled. Their task is impossible, their labor is meaningless, and their punishment is eternal. It is a perfect, ironic reflection of their crime. Just as they had created a marriage that was empty and meaningless, a union that was immediately drained of its life and purpose, they are now condemned to an eternity of trying to fill a vessel that can never hold anything. A constant, frustrating reminder of their horrific and pointless act of murder. Not all of the terrifying beings in the underworld were there to punish souls after they had been judged. Some were agents of vengeance who could pursue the guilty even in the world of the living, driving them to madness and despair long before they reached the realm of Hades. These were the Erinyes, more famously known as the Furies, 3 fearsome goddesses of retribution whose sole purpose was to hunt down and torment those who had committed the most terrible of crimes. The Furies were ancient, primal beings, born from a horrific act of violence at the very beginning of time. When the Titan Cronus attacked his father, the sky god Uranus, drops of Uranus's blood fell upon the earth, and from this divine blood the Furies were born. This dark and violent origin gave them their relentless and terrifying nature. They were not like the Olympian gods, who could be reasoned with or appeased. The Furies were single-minded, unstoppable forces of divine justice, the personification of a curse. There were three of them: Alecto, whose name means the unceasing; Megaera, the grudging; and Tisiphone, the avenger of murder. They were depicted as horrific, hag-like women, with snakes for hair, eyes that dripped blood, and the wings of bats. They carried sharp scourges or whips in their hands, and their very presence was enough to instill terror and madness in their victims. They lived in the darkest part of the underworld, in a place called Erebus, but they could rise to the surface of the earth whenever they were summoned by a particularly heinous crime. The Furies were not concerned with all sins. Their primary focus was on crimes that violated the most sacred laws of kinship and blood. They were the avengers of patricide and matricide, the punishers of those who had killed their own parents or children. They also pursued those who had broken a sacred oath sworn to a family member. When such a crime was committed, the Furies would be awakened, and they would begin their relentless pursuit of the guilty party. They would hunt their victims without rest, their terrifying cries echoing in their ears. They would appear to them in their dreams, turning their sleep into a nightmare. They would drive them to the edge of madness, their minds filled with guilt and terror. The Furies were a constant, inescapable presence, a living embodiment of the victim's own guilty conscience. They would not stop their torment until the sinner had either been driven to suicide or had undergone a difficult and painful process of ritual purification. One of the most famous stories involving the Furies is that of Orestes, the son of Agamemnon. After his father was murdered by his mother Clytemnestra, Orestes was commanded by the god Apollo to avenge his father's death by killing his mother. He obeyed, but in doing so, he committed the terrible crime of matricide. Instantly, the Furies were upon him. They pursued him across the land, driving him to the brink of insanity. His journey of torment finally ended in Athens, where he was put on trial before the goddess Athena and a jury of Athenian citizens. In a landmark case, Athena cast the deciding vote to acquit him, and she then transformed the Furies from terrifying agents of vengeance into the Eumenides, or the kindly ones, giving them a new role as protectors of justice in the city. This story shows the complex and powerful role of the Furies. They were not simply monsters. They were a fundamental part of the Greek moral universe, a terrifying but necessary force that ensured that the most sacred laws of family and blood were never broken without terrible consequences. In the vast and complex geography of the underworld, with its rivers of woe, fire, and wailing, there was one river that offered not pain, but peace, not torment, but a quiet and final release. This was the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. Its waters were not dark and turbulent, but slow, silent, and milky white. To drink from the river Lethe was to erase the memories of your mortal life, to wash away all the joys, sorrows, triumphs, and traumas, and to enter a state of peaceful, blissful oblivion. The river Lethe flowed through the Elysian Fields, the paradise of the blessed, and its purpose was twofold. For the souls who were destined to be reborn back into the world of the living, drinking from its waters was a necessary step. Before a soul could begin a new life, it had to be wiped clean of the memories of its past one. This ensured that the new life would be a fresh start, unburdened by the successes or failures of the old one. The soul would drink from the milky white river, and a gentle, dreamlike haze would descend upon its consciousness, erasing all that had come before. It was a merciful act, allowing the soul to be a blank slate, ready to face the challenges of a new mortal existence. But The river Lethe also served another, more profound purpose. For the souls who were destined to spend eternity in the underworld, particularly those in the monotonous asphodel meadows, drinking from the Lethe was a way to find a strange kind of peace. Life, for the ancient Greeks, was a thing of passion, of vibrant, intense experiences. To be a shade in the underworld, to be a pale imitation of your former self, and to still remember the warmth of the sun, the taste of wine, or the embrace of a loved one, would be a form of subtle, unending torture. And so, the souls would come to the banks of the Lethe. They would cup their translucent hands and drink deeply of its magical, forgetful waters. As they drank, the sharp edges of their memories would begin to soften. The faces of their loved ones would blur and fade. The triumphs that had once filled them with pride and the tragedies that had broken their hearts would all dissolve into a single, undifferentiated grayness. They would not become completely blank, but they would lose the emotional weight of their past. They would become listless, passive, and calm, able to wander the asphodel meadows for eternity, without the constant, painful ache of longing for the world they had lost. This act of forgetting was a double-edged sword. It offered a release from pain, but it also meant the loss of identity. The very things that had made a person who they were, their loves, their struggles, their accomplishments, were washed away in the milky white current. It was a quiet, somber end to the human experience, a final, gentle surrender to the eternal, unchanging reality of the underworld. The river Lethe was a powerful symbol of the Greek understanding of death. It was not just a physical transition, but a psychological one, a final, irreversible journey away from the light and passion of life into a state of quiet, dreamlike peace. Among the 5 great rivers that snaked their way through the dark landscapes of the underworld, there was one that was the very embodiment of audible grief. This was the river Cocytus, a name that translates to the river of wailing. It was not a river of water in the traditional sense, but a slow, sluggish channel filled with the collected tears and lamentations of lost and forgotten souls. Its sound was a constant, mournful symphony of sorrow that echoed through the misty air, a chilling reminder of the pain that came with certain kinds of death. The river Cocytus was often described as a tributary of the river Styx, flowing through the gloomiest and most desolate parts of the underworld. Its banks were barren and gray, lined with weeping willow trees that seemed to droop with the weight of eternal sadness. The river itself was a thick, dark, and icy cold stream, its current barely moving, as if weighed down by the sheer volume of grief it contained. To stand near its edge was to feel a profound and overwhelming sense of despair, to hear the faint, disembodied cries of countless souls who had been denied their final rest. This river was most closely associated with a specific and tragic group of the dead, the unburied. In ancient Greece, proper burial was not just a tradition. It was a sacred and absolute necessity for a soul's peaceful passage into the afterlife. Those who died in battle and were left on the field, those who were lost at sea, or those whose families neglected their duties were condemned to a terrible fate. Their souls, unable to pay Charon the ferryman, could not cross the river Acheron or the Styx. Instead, they were forced to wander the bleak shores as restless, tormented shades. The river Cocytus was their domain. It was here that these unburied souls would gather, their shadowy forms huddled together on the cold banks. It was their endless, sorrowful wails that gave the river its name. They would cry out for the peace they could not find, for the families who had forgotten them, for the final rest that was denied to them. Their lamentations were a constant, heartbreaking sound, a chorus of eternal regret and longing. They could see the other souls being ferried across to their final judgment, but they were trapped, stuck in a miserable limbo between the world of the living and the true realm of the dead. The story of Odysseus's journey to the underworld provides a powerful image of this. When he visited the land of the dead, he encountered the soul of his comrade, Elpenor, who had died accidentally and been left unburied. Elpenor's shade was pathetic and sorrowful, begging Odysseus to return to the world of the living and give his body the proper funeral rites so that his soul could finally leave the banks of the Cocytus and find peace. This encounter highlights the deep-seated fear and pity that the Greeks had for the unburied dead. The river of wailing was a place of profound sadness, a testament to the importance of remembrance and respect for the dead. It was a constant, audible reminder that the journey to the afterlife was a fragile one, and that the actions of the living had a direct and powerful impact on the fate of the souls who had passed on. It was a river of tears, a place where the grief of the forgotten was given a voice, a sorrowful, unending cry that haunted the darkest corners of Hades' kingdom. In the grim topography of the Greek underworld, amidst the rivers of sorrow, wailing, and forgetfulness, there was one river that was a pure, terrifying spectacle of divine punishment. This was the river Phlegethon, also known as the Pyriphlegethon, which translates to the river of fire, or flaming with fire. Unlike the other rivers, the Phlegethon was not made of water, but of pure molten lava, a roaring fiery torrent that flowed through the darkest depths of the cosmos and illuminated the horrors of Tartarus. The Phlegethon was a river of active, intense torment. Its purpose was not to evoke sadness or to erase memory, but to inflict pain and to serve as a barrier for the most wicked of souls. It was often described as a tributary of the river Acheron, but its primary role was as a key feature of Tartarus, the great pit of eternal punishment. The river snaked its way through the bleak, rocky landscape of Tartarus, its fiery current casting a hellish, flickering red glow on the suffering souls who were imprisoned there. The roar of its flames and the intense, searing heat it gave off were a constant, terrifying presence, a symbol of the burning wrath of the gods. The river itself was a form of punishment. Its fiery waters were said to be able to burn away the impurities of a soul, a painful and violent form of purification. For the souls condemned to Tartarus, the Phlegethon was an inescapable part of their torment. They might be forced to stand in its searing currents, their ghostly forms writhing in agony, or they might be imprisoned on its banks, forever scorched by its intense heat. The river was a constant reminder of the burning consequences of their wicked deeds. But the Phlegethon also served as a boundary. It was one of the great walls of Tartarus, a fiery moat that surrounded the prison of the Titans and the most heinous mortal sinners. Its roaring, impassable flames ensured that no soul could ever escape its designated punishment. To even approach the river was to feel an unbearable heat, and to fall into its current was to be consumed by a fire that never went out. In some stories, the Phlegethon was also seen as a place of renewal, in a dark and twisted way. The philosopher Plato, in his writings, suggested that the souls of those who had committed terrible acts of violence but were deemed curable were sent to the Phlegethon. There, they would be swept along in its fiery current until they came to a place where they could see the souls of those they had wronged. They would have to cry out to their victims and beg for forgiveness. If their victims took pity on them and forgave them, they would be released from the river, and their suffering would end. If not, they would be swept back into the fiery torrent to suffer for another year, until they could once again plead for mercy. This idea adds a layer of complexity to the river of fire. It was not just a place of mindless, eternal torment, but a place of potential, if painful, redemption for some. However, for most, the Phlegethon remained a symbol of pure, unadulterated punishment, a fiery, roaring testament to the terrible and inescapable consequences of defying the gods and living a life of profound wickedness. It was the burning, liquid heart of Tartarus, a river of divine fire in the darkest corner of the universe. We return now to a river we have met before, but whose importance is so central to the journey of the dead that it deserves a second, deeper look. This is the river Acheron, the river of woe. While the Styx is more famous for its unbreakable oaths, it is the Acheron that often serves as the true gateway to the underworld, the first and most significant body of water that a soul must cross. It is more than just a river. It is the grand, sorrowful entrance hall to the kingdom of Hades, a place of passage, of payment, and of profound, world-altering change. In many accounts, it is on the banks of the Acheron, not the Styx, that the newly departed souls gather in their silent, fluttering multitudes. Imagine the scene, a vast gray and misty plain stretching out to the edge of a wide, dark, and slow-moving river. The air is thick with a palpable sense of sorrow, a collective grief that seems to rise from the murky water itself. On the near bank, countless shades, looking like dim, smoky outlines of their former selves, press forward, their translucent hands outstretched, their silent mouths open in a plea that makes no sound. They are waiting for the ferryman, the grim and ancient Charon, to carry them across to the other side. The Acheron is the great checkpoint of the dead. It is here that the most important rule of passage is enforced, the payment of the obelisk. Charon, with his stern, weathered face and his long wooden pole, will only allow those souls who can pay the fare to board his rickety skiff. He is the unyielding gatekeeper, the first official of the underworld that a soul encounters. His presence on the Acheron turns the river into a place of separation. It is here that the souls who were given a proper burial with the coin placed under their tongue are separated from those who were not. For those who can pay, the journey across the Acheron is a somber and final one. As Charon poles the boat through the dark, sorrowful water, the world of the living, with all its light and color and feeling, fades away completely. The soul is enveloped by the gloom of the underworld, the quiet, unchanging reality of the dead. The crossing is a powerful symbol of the soul's acceptance of its new state. It is a willing passage, a paid transaction that signifies the end of one life and the beginning of another, albeit a shadowy and diminished one. But for those who cannot pay, the banks of the Acheron are a place of eternal frustration and torment. They are the unburied, the forgotten, the ones whose living relatives failed in their most sacred duty. They are forced to wander the bleak, misty shores for 100 years, their mournful cries joining the chorus of sorrow that gives the river its name. They can see the other souls leaving, but they are trapped, stuck in a miserable limbo, forever yearning for a passage that is denied to them. The river Acheron, therefore, is a place of profound significance. It is the first taste of the underworld's sorrow, the first encounter with its strict and unyielding laws, and the first great separation of the dead based on the actions of the living. It is the river of passage, the sorrowful gray threshold over which every soul, if properly prepared, must travel to begin its true journey into the eternal mystery of Hades' vast and silent kingdom. The laws of the underworld were absolute. The boundary between the living and the dead was meant to be unbreakable, a one-way street from which there was no return. Hades guarded his realm jealously, and his fearsome sentinels, from the grumpy ferryman Charon to the monstrous three-headed hound Cerberus, ensured that the dead stayed in and the living stayed out. Yet, in the grand tapestry of Greek mythology, there were a few rare and extraordinary individuals, heroes of immense power, courage, or talent, who managed to defy this ultimate rule. They were the living mortals who journeyed into the land of the dead, and, even more remarkably, returned to the sunlit world to tell the tale. These were not casual visits. Each hero who descended into the underworld did so for a desperate and compelling reason, often as part of an impossible quest or a divine command. Their journeys were fraught with peril, and their success was never guaranteed. One of the most famous of these visitors was the legendary musician, Orpheus. Driven by a love so powerful it transcended death itself, Orpheus journeyed into the darkness to bring back his beloved wife Eurydice, who had been killed by a snakebite. He did not use force or trickery, but the power of his art. His music was so beautiful and so filled with sorrow that it charmed the savage heart of Cerberus, moved the stern ferryman Charon to tears, and even softened the cold, unyielding will of Hades and Persephone themselves. They agreed to let Eurydice return with him, but on one condition: he must walk ahead of her and not look back until they were both fully in the world of the living. Tragically, at the very last moment, filled with doubt and longing, Orpheus looked back, and Eurydice was pulled back into the shadows forever. His journey was a heartbreaking failure, a powerful reminder of the fragility of hope and the unforgiving nature of the underworld's laws. Another great hero who made the journey was the mighty Heracles. As his 12th and final labor, a task designed to be impossible, he was commanded to capture Cerberus and bring him to the surface. Heracles, a son of Zeus, was a being of almost divine strength. He descended into the underworld, not with music, but with sheer indomitable power. He wrestled the monstrous hound into submission and, with the permission of a grudgingly respectful Hades, he dragged the beast into the world of the living, completing his labor before returning the guardian to his post. His journey was a testament to his incredible physical prowess, a victory of strength over the forces of death. The clever Odysseus also visited the underworld, not to rescue someone, but to seek knowledge. On the command of the sorceress Circe, he traveled to the land of the dead to consult the soul of the blind prophet Tiresias, who was the only one who could tell him how to get home. Odysseus did not venture deep into the realm, but performed a ritual at its entrance, digging a pit and filling it with the blood of sacrificed animals. The blood attracted the thirsty shades, and he was able to speak with Tiresias, as well as with the souls of his mother, his fallen comrades like Achilles and Agamemnon, and many other famous figures. His journey was one of intellect and courage, a quest for information that was vital to his survival. These heroes, and a few others like them, were the rare exceptions to the rule. Their journeys into the underworld were extraordinary feats that set them apart from all other mortals. They were able to face the ultimate mystery and return, their stories serving as a testament to the power of love, strength, and cunning. But even in their success, their tales reinforced the fundamental truth of the Greek afterlife. The underworld was a place of immense power and strict laws, a realm that could be visited by the living, but never truly conquered. For most ancient Greeks, the vision of the afterlife was a grim one. The vast majority of souls were destined for the gray, monotonous fields of asphodel, a place of eternal boredom and forgetfulness. The paradise of Elysium was reserved for a tiny elite of heroes and demigods, while the horrors of Tartarus awaited the truly wicked. But was there any hope for the ordinary person? Was there a way for a common farmer, craftsman, or merchant to secure a happier fate in the world beyond the grave? For many, the answer lay in the secret religious rites known as the Elysian Mysteries. The Elysian Mysteries were a set of secret initiation ceremonies that took place each year in the town of Eleusis, not far from Athens. They were dedicated to the goddesses Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and her daughter Persephone, the queen of the underworld. The Mysteries were one of the most important and popular religious cults in ancient Greece, and their influence lasted for thousands of years. What made them so special was that they were open to everyone. Anyone, man or woman, free or slave, rich or poor, could become an initiate, as long as they could speak Greek and had not committed the crime of murder. The details of the Mysteries were a closely guarded secret. The initiates were sworn to absolute secrecy, and they were forbidden from ever revealing what they saw and experienced during the ceremonies. To break this oath was a crime punishable by death. This secrecy has made it difficult for modern scholars to know exactly what happened during the rites, but we can piece together a general idea from various ancient sources. The Mysteries were a multi-day festival that involved a sacred procession from Athens to Eleusis. The initiates would fast, purify themselves in the sea, and then enter a great dark hall called the Telesterion. Inside this hall, the climax of the Mysteries would take place. It is believed that the initiates would witness a sacred drama, a kind of religious play, that reenacted the story of Demeter's frantic search for her abducted daughter, Persephone. They would experience the sorrow of Demeter, the darkness of the underworld, and the joy of Persephone's return. It is also thought that they were shown sacred objects and that they may have drunk a special psychoactive barley potion called the kykeon, which could have induced powerful visions. The goal of all this was to give the initiates a profound spiritual experience, to bring them closer to the goddesses of life, death, and rebirth. By reliving the story of Persephone, who had descended into the underworld and returned, the initiates were given a powerful hope that they, too, could have a positive fate after death. The Mysteries did not promise to make them immortal, but they did promise a happier and more meaningful afterlife. The initiates of the Elysian Mysteries believed that when they died, they would not be condemned to the bleak fields of asphodel. Instead, they would be granted a special place in the underworld, a realm of light and peace, similar to the Elysian Fields. They would be welcomed by Persephone, their patron goddess, and they would spend eternity in a state of blissful contentment. This promise of a better afterlife was a powerful source of comfort and hope for countless ordinary Greeks. It gave them a sense of control over their own destiny, a way to ensure that their journey into the great unknown would lead not to a place of sorrow and forgetting, but to a realm of eternal light and joy. The underworld was not just a place of punishment and reward, it was also a vast, shadowy repository of history, a place where the souls of all who had ever lived continued to exist in a diminished, ghostly form. For the heroes who made the rare journey into Hades' realm, one of the most profound and unsettling experiences was the opportunity to meet the shades of the famous figures who had come before them. These encounters, most famously described in Homer's Odyssey, provided a powerful and often tragic glimpse into the nature of death and the fates of even the greatest of mortals. When Odysseus traveled to the entrance of the underworld, the first soul he recognized was that of his own mother, Anticlea. He had not even known she was dead, and the sight of her ghostly form filled him with immense grief. He tried to embrace her 3 times, but each time his arms passed right through her, as if she were nothing but smoke or shadow. She told him that this was the fate of all mortals after death. The fire consumes the flesh and bones, and the soul flutters away like a dream. This heartbreaking encounter was a powerful lesson for Odysseus, a stark reminder of the unbridgeable gap that now separated him from the mother he loved. Soon, other famous shades began to gather, drawn by the scent of the sacrificial blood. Odysseus saw a procession of famous queens and princesses, women whose stories were woven into the very fabric of Greek mythology. But it was the arrival of his former comrades from the Trojan War that had the most powerful impact on him. He saw Agamemnon, the great king who had led the Greek army. Agamemnon's shade was a bitter and sorrowful figure. He told Odysseus the tragic story of his homecoming, how he had been murdered in his own palace by his treacherous wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover. His story was a grim warning to Odysseus about the dangers of trusting too much, even in your own home. Then came the shade of the greatest warrior of them all, the mighty Achilles. Odysseus greeted him as a king, telling him that he must be a great ruler even among the dead. But Achilles' response was one of the most famous and poignant lines in all of Greek literature. He told Odysseus that he would rather be a lowly, landless peasant, a serf working for a poor farmer in the world of the living, than be the king of all the dead. This was a shocking statement from the hero who had chosen a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one. It revealed the terrible truth of the Greek afterlife, even for the greatest of heroes. The shadowy, passionless existence of a shade was a pale and miserable imitation of the vibrant, colorful world of the living. Odysseus also saw the shade of the great hero Ajax, who had been his rival for the armor of Achilles. Ajax was still consumed by the anger and resentment that had led to his suicide, and he refused to speak to Odysseus, turning his back and stalking away into the darkness. This encounter showed that even in death, the powerful emotions and grudges of life could linger, a tormenting echo of a past that could never be changed. These meetings with the famous dead were a profound and sobering experience for Odysseus, a journey that taught him more about the true nature of life and death than any battle or adventure ever could. The underworld was more than just a collection of rivers, fields, and pits of punishment. It was a kingdom, a vast and complex domain with its own ruler, its own laws, and its own unique form of power. At the center of it all was Hades, the stern and silent king, whose authority was absolute and whose rules were unbreakable. To understand the underworld is to understand the nature of Hades's power, a power based not on flashy displays of force, but on the quiet, unyielding principles of order, wealth, and the finality of death itself. Hades's power stemmed, first and foremost, from his role as the ruler of the dead. Every mortal, from the most powerful king to the most humble slave, would one day become his subject. This gave him a kingdom of unimaginable size, a silent, ever-growing population of souls. Unlike his brother Zeus, who had to constantly deal with the schemes and rebellions of the other gods, Hades ruled over a kingdom of perfect order. The shades of the dead were passive and obedient, and the laws of his realm were never challenged. His word was final, and his judgments were eternal. But Hades was not just the king of the dead, he was also the god of the earth's hidden wealth. His Roman name, Pluto, literally means the rich one, and this was no exaggeration. All of the precious metals and gems that lay hidden deep within the earth, the gold, the silver, the diamonds, the rubies, all belonged to him. His palace was said to be made of these precious materials, a place of dark, glittering splendor. This immense wealth gave him a different kind of power, a quiet, solid authority that was rooted in the very foundations of the earth. While the Olympian gods feasted and fought in the sky, Hades sat on his throne of ebony, the silent, wealthy master of all that lay beneath the surface. The most important aspect of Hades's power, however, was his role as the guardian of the great divide between life and death. He was incredibly strict about maintaining this separation. The living were not welcome in his realm, and the dead were never, ever allowed to leave. This was not because he was cruel, but because he understood that the natural order of the cosmos depended on it. He was the great enforcer of this fundamental law, and his entire kingdom was designed to uphold it. The impassable rivers, the grim ferryman Charon, the monstrous guardian Cerberus, all were extensions of his will, tools to ensure that the boundary between the two worlds remained absolute. Hades rarely used his power in a dramatic or violent way. He was not a god of war or thunder. He was a god of quiet, unyielding authority. He did not need to boast or threaten. His power was self-evident. It was the power of the inevitable, the power of the final destination that awaits all mortals. He was a just ruler, and his punishments were always fitting for the crimes committed. He was stern, yes, but he was also fair. In a world of often chaotic and unpredictable gods, Hades was a figure of stability and order. The silent, powerful king of the vast and mysterious kingdom of the dead. Manish.